Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in.
How have you been? Things going well?
Yeah, things are going great. How about yourself?
Awesome. Things are going great. I'm here in San Francisco. I enjoyed the recent episodes with you on Tyler Cowen and Econ Talk.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
Did you enjoy doing them?
in some ways, I don't think I'm really at my best in these kind of interviews, but Tyler asks a lot of challenging questions, and so sometimes I have a little bit of a struggle to, you know, think of a good answer, but I did my best anyway.
I was struck in the Tyler Cowen interview when you said that you feel like you've lived 98% of your life, even if you got 20 more years left. That time just goes by so fast. Part of the reason I was struck is because I'm only 35, but even I just feel that time is just going faster in my 30s than it was in my 20s.
Yeah, unfortunately, it keeps accelerating, but anyway, that's the way it is.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll let Noah in a second. Hello, Scott. How do you like to be introduced as an economist? Obviously you were at Mercatus as director of monetary policy. You've written several books on on one of the big depression. You've written sort of pioneered sort of this nominal GDP targeting, which we'll get into, although we're going to spend a majority of our time on industrial policy. You're one of the earliest bloggers in the econ space, a tradition that Noah and others have also pioneered. Scott, how do you like to be introduced as an economist, or what's missing from that intro?
Well, most of my career I taught at Bentley College. I guess I'm a monetary economist, especially interested in monetary history. So I wrote a book on the Great Depression, also one on the Great Recession. I'm sometimes called a market monetarist for my views on monetary policy. I didn't really pioneer NGDP targeting exactly, but I've certainly emphasized it. And so that's about it, I guess.
Yeah. Noah, where do you fit into the world of economists in terms of your slant or bent, or how do you think of yourself?
The world is full of people who are not economists who call themselves economists. So I try to balance out the karmic balance by not calling myself an economist. So I call myself an econ writer, which I think is accurate. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm more of a generalist. I studied macroeconomics in PhD school, and then I switched to behavioral finance and did my dissertation on that. And then taught finance for a couple of years at Stony Brook, and then here I am. But yeah, so then, I never really specialized in like monetary issues to the point that Scott has thought about these. But I also feel that at the national level, important economic policy is made in large part by people like Scott and myself. I think that if you look at every big paradigm shift, including the shift to Reaganomics, or neoliberalism, quote unquote, or the New Deal, you see people like Scott and me who basically write about these ideas and maybe read research, but certainly synthesize ideas. And I think at the center of it, I think that we're having this transition to something called industrial policy, and we don't quite know what that is, as our kind of new economic paradigm of what we're doing, reindustrialization, including like abundance and all this kind of stuff. And what that means is highly contested, and we don't exactly know what that is going to mean yet. And I think that people like Scott and myself will be key to shaping what that means. So this is an important discussion.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So Scott, you went on Russ Roberts' great podcast Econ Talk, and sort of made the case for your thoughts on sort of against industrial policy to some extent, or you had some sort of critiques of it. Why don't you sort of outline the high level of your argument, and then we can get into the specific parts of it, because there'll be some parts where there's overlap and some parts where there's a sort of difference of opinion.
Okay, and just to follow up on my self-description, I probably could have added that I'm sort of a unreconstructed neoliberal. Neoliberalism, in my view, was the dominant policy framework from the 80s to the early 2000s. I think it was the most successful policy framework in human history. It did a lot of wonderful things. I do think the world is moving away from neoliberalism in a variety of ways, both political and economic. Politically, we're moving towards sort of authoritarian nationalism. But in terms of economic policy, which is where we'll focus today, I see less belief in ideas like free trade, free markets, deregulation, privatization, those kind of concepts today than there was back in the late 20th century. So my own views actually haven't changed much, but I have seen the sort of zeitgeist move in the direction towards industrial policy. I'm not opposed to all industrial policies, but I would describe myself as a skeptic that is especially skeptical of industrial policy in the trade area, a little less skeptical of subsidies and things like that. And I'm also probably a lot older than both of you. I'll be 70 this year. So I've lived through some other cycles. I've lived through the 60s period where there's a lot of optimism about government. I've lived through the late 80s when there was a feeling that we needed to adopt industrial policy because we were losing or falling behind Japan, and their success was supposedly due to industrial policy. So I've seen kind of these cycles of belief in markets come and go over the course of my life, and I'm not convinced that there's a need for a major rethink. There may be some need for tweaking to address specific policies. And there's even a few areas like global warming where I favor certain policies that you could call industrial policy, like a carbon tax, for instance.
Right. And so I suspect the biggest sort of divergence of opinion is going to be on the China topic or on the foreign policy topic. But before we get to that, why don't you outline the sort of, in the podcast, you did a good job of outlining the cases that people make for it. And you could say sort of why you don't think it's a great idea to move in that direction.
Wait a second, why am I not outlining those?
Oh, Noah, why don't you do it?
Yeah, why don't I outline the case for industrial policy? Let's not make Scott do too much work here.
Go for it, Noah. Let's do it.
Right. So I think that the cases for industrial policy, the case that everyone's talking about now is military related. In World War II, we converted all these manufacturing lines to, like auto production. We built bombers from that, and ship production. We built the Liberty ships, and then we also, there was some mixing of civilian and military shipyards at the time, and blah blah. Whatever the technologies of World War II were, we dual purposed that stuff. And so now China has all this manufacturing capacity, and we and our allies increasingly don't. I think China approximately now in manufacturing capacity matches us and all our allies combined. We haven't seen a situation where where totalitarians manufacture more than democracies since pre-industrial era. This is the first time in the industrial age when we've seen that. And of course, I value freedom, including economic freedom, but economic freedom is not going to mean anything when when you're ruled from Beijing. Just look at what's going on there, and how it is being an entrepreneur in China right now, and tell me that we'll have more economic freedom in a real world from Beijing. And so I think that's an argument that, and of course, Beijing isn't necessarily going to rule the world in exactly the way that the Nazis would have ruled the world, or even the Stalin and Mao would have ruled the world, but it certainly, will not be good for our economic freedom or the economic freedom of people around the world. Especially just look at what's happening in the South China Sea, with China trying to get rid of freedom of the seas, which is one of the sort of main pillars of economic freedom and free trade in the world. And so I think that that's the argument that's resonating with both Democrats and Republicans. I think that Democrats and Republicans then have each come up with their own more politicized arguments for industrial policy. So Democrats have talked about fighting climate change and creating good jobs. I'm very skeptical of the creating good jobs idea. I think that's a misdirection. That's bad. I think that we want good jobs will simply come from a high demand economy, and I think Scott and I'll probably agree on that. There's no reason to use industrial policy to promote jobs as such. But climate change, I think there is some argument for that, but I think that's sort of like going to be taken care of by sort of building a bunch of green energy and as well. So I think that that'll be taken care of incidentally to a lot of these other things. And then Republicans, have the MAGA idea of America first, protect American workers, blah blah blah. Not too different from what Bernie Sanders might recommend. And I think I'm a little more skeptical of that too. So I think some of because again, I think that good jobs will come from a high pressure economy. And I also think that in many ways we need to expand free trade in order to create good jobs, if you will, or just raise productivity, et cetera. And so I think that Scott and I will probably agree when it comes to a lot of those partisan justifications for industrial policy. But I think that it's on the bipartisan sort of concern about China that I think we may disagree. But I don't want to put words in Scott's mouth, but that's my best guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. So let me take the easiest cases first where we may partly agree. If we look at industrial policy to address global warming, I think what ends up happening, although there is a strong case for it, and I mentioned the carbon tax as an idea, what we get is policies that are actually counterproductive in many cases. In the Biden administration, there was a push for subsidies for things like electric cars and solar panels and so on. But in my view, the other steps taken, such as trade barriers on Chinese EVs and solar panels, more than counteracted the benefits of those subsidies. So if we did nothing, no subsidies and no trade barriers, we'd be ahead of where we are in terms of electronic vehicles today because companies like BYD are just so good at producing them. So I think that's been kind of counterproductive, although we can come back to the foreign policy implications of China trade later. But in terms of just the environment, even under the Biden administration, which had some talented people, we often didn't get the sort of industrial policy you'd want from the textbook. Now we're moving into the Trump administration that doesn't seem to have any qualified people in any top positions, one or two exceptions maybe. But I don't have any faith in the Trump administration doing an industrial policy that is in the nation's interest. So even though there are textbook arguments for industrial policy, in certain cases, when you get into the politics of it, it becomes much more dicey. The other point I would make is that a lot of the industrial policies, I think, are based on misconceptions about how the macroeconomy works. I'll just give you one example. A lot of people favor trade barriers to boost U.S. manufacturing. In my view, those do not work, and in fact haven't worked under the last two administrations because the root cause of our current account deficit is a savings investment imbalance, which is not really addressed through trade barriers. And as a result, a truly effective policy of, say, reducing the trade deficit and boosting manufacturing would involve addressing that savings investment imbalance. My preference would be through a more responsible fiscal policy, smaller deficits, maybe also incentives to save more. But if you believe, like I do, and many international macroeconomists believe, that the savings investment imbalance is the root cause of our trade deficit, then you can't really address that through things like tariffs. But when you get into the political realm, people look for the easiest solutions. And obviously tariffs are a lot easier to grab than a major increase in taxes or cut in spending, which would be required to address our savings investment imbalance. So I think sometimes even when they identify a problem, they come up with solutions that are not really reflective of how the macroeconomy actually works.
Yes, I think that is quite correct.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/102. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102. Most of you probably know how much the Turpentine team loves Notion, the sponsor of today's episode. We use it every day for editorial planning, transcript markups, project managing, knowledge sharing, and it's where I drop random 3 a.m. ideas that turn into episodes. Now it has the power of AI, built right inside of Notion and woven across our entire workspace. It's been a total game changer for our productivity and focus. We just used it the other day to architect the content schedule for next month across our network. Notion combines your notes, docs, and projects into one space that's simple and beautifully designed. The fully integrated Notion AI helps you work faster, write better, and think bigger, doing tasks that normally take you hours in just seconds. Try Notion for free when you go to notion.com/upstreampod. That's all lowercase letters. Notion.com/upstreampod to try the powerful, easy to use Notion AI today. And when you use our link, you're supporting our show. That's notion.com/upstreampod.
I would agree with 90% of what you just said. I think, and the other 10% might just be me quibbling with particular kinds of language. I think that, well, an interesting thing to point out is that the reason, so you said that if we had just completely opened ourselves to Chinese green technologies, solar and batteries, that would accelerate the fight against U.S. emissions and climate change, and thus mildly accelerate the fight against climate change worldwide. That is correct. However, it's also important to understand that that the fact that these things are made cheaply in such high volumes in China is not entirely due to the independent competitive success of some of the companies making these, but is due in substantial part to Chinese industrial policies that have encouraged massive capacity and massive buildouts of those things. And so someone's industrial policy somewhere is making that happen. And if we implement unilateral free trade and simply say, okay, give us your solar and batteries, I agree with you that that would accelerate the fight against climate change, but I think it's an important caveat. It's an important thing to note that the reason it would is because someone somewhere is doing a lot of probably economically inefficient, but maybe efficient, industrial policy, but that may be efficient once you take into account the externality of climate. And I, can't tell you off the top of my head whether it is, but, for a long time in the 2010s, a lot of people were saying, well, in order to solve the externality of climate change, you can do a carbon tax, but then and if you had a world government, a carbon tax would clearly just be the right way to go. But given that you don't, a carbon tax in one country can lead to other countries sort of free riding. And you have this coordination problem between countries. And that's because global warming is global, right? If one country is like, okay, we're just going to do a carbon tax, and you know what? It's going to kill our heavy manufacturing and blah, blah, blah. Some other country will be like, I'll do the heavy manufacturing. Sure. And then they'll get cheap fossil fuels and blah, blah, blah. And so you'll mitigate or even eliminate the impact, and in addition to just preferentially harming your own economy and bearing much more than your own proportional share of the cost of fighting climate change. And I think that's the externality, that's the coordination problem. And so a lot of people in the 2010s were pointing out what you actually want to do if you're a big country. What you actually want to do is you want to innovate and you want to promote the production of large amounts of batteries and solar, because what that does is, through the magic of learning curves, it drives down the price of these things. And then India, and then, will industrialize using solar first instead of even going through the intermediate stage of coal, and maybe Indonesia and these other countries. And then, developed countries will more easily and cheaply switch to the new alternatives. And so what we need to do is just do this big push. If you look at why the cost of solar and batteries has declined, you see that at first it was due to research, but later it was due to scaling. And scaling, technological learning curves, that has been the main reason why the cost of solar and batteries has come down so much. We didn't do this. We yelled online, and then we didn't end up doing this. China did it. The Chinese Communist Party, I don't know if they got this idea from like Ramez Nam and the other people who were saying this idea, but they did it for us. They helped us. Thank you, China, for building a ton of solar and batteries really cheaply, even though it may not have been economically efficient in terms of, all the little Harbinger triangles and static efficiency for you at the time. You did it, and it has helped us decarbonize. And through our tariffs, we partially blocked that. But we didn't block a lot of it. Overall, cheap Chinese solar and batteries have been changing the world successfully. This is not just a success for China's industrial policy in terms of like providing jobs or whatever they did it for, or exports, whatever they did it for. It's been a success in terms of actually fighting climate change. China is, although it's the biggest contributor to climate change because it burns a lot of coal, it's also the biggest opponent of climate change in making green tech cheap. And that's sort of the contradiction of China. So I think that's an important thing to mention.
Okay, good points. A couple responses. It is true that the carbon tax has been politically unpopular, but one of the things we discovered during the Biden administration is a lot of the alternatives, like restricting energy production, also turned out to be politically unpopular and had to be reversed at some point during the Biden administration. So there aren't really necessarily any easy solutions there. On the question of how important the Chinese industrial policy was in the promotion of their manufacturing, I think this is a very tough issue. And I like to spend a couple minutes kind of looking back at the history of this debate because I don't think there's any easy answers here. As you probably know, there's also been earlier debates about how important was industrial policy in Japan's success, South Korea's success, and so on. And you can find good arguments on both sides of that issue. But one of the things that I found is that people often will cite a particular success and overlook the fact that there's other examples that cut the other way. So there were Japanese industrial policies that failed to do what they were desired to do. And also, if you look at the broader picture of sort of the East Asian success story, let's say over the last 50, 75 years, it's clear that there was something going on in East Asia in manufacturing that probably went beyond industrial policy because many countries in that region saw explosive growth rates with different policy regimes. In some of them, like in South Korea, there was substantial industrial policy. In others, like Singapore or Hong Kong, there was more free trade. But wherever you had the basic open economy structure in East Asia, you tended to get very rapid growth. So it's really hard to know exactly how much role industrial policy played. In addition, in places like South Korea, sometimes the industrial policies worked at cross purposes, again, because of people's lack of understanding of how trade theory works. So they would have tariffs on imports and subsidies on exports. Well, those basically net out to zero, at least if they're uniform, right? A 10% across the board tariff and a 10% across the board export subsidy nets out to free trade essentially. So I think people exaggerated the extent to which countries like South Korea were deviating from what you might call a market economy model. There was certainly substantial deviation, but I think a lot less than people assumed because of the policies often working in opposite directions and counterbalancing each other. So when I look at China, I see a country that just has enormous comparative advantage in manufacturing. And it's difficult for me to know when you look at a particular industry like EVs, how much of that success is coming from a specific government policy of encouraging EVs, and how much of it is coming from the fact that China just has massive comparative advantage in a lot of certain types of manufacturing. And I would note with EV, we're moving into a type of manufacturing where the advantage China has is even stronger than the old internal combustion engine, where countries like Germany have a comparative advantage, for instance. So we're moving into a more electronic type of car that's mass produced, a simpler thing with fewer parts. And that's where Chinese producers just excel at low cost in almost everything. So I'm sure we could find lots of other manufactured goods in China that haven't been encouraged by the government, where they've been similar spectacular success stories of dominating global exports in those areas. I'm not saying you're wrong. There could have been some benefits of Chinese government push in clean energy, and maybe those were good things. You know, I'm in favor of doing something about global warming. Again, I prefer a simpler approach like carbon taxes or whatever, but even if there were benefits there, I don't think we have handled them well in terms of our response. And that's really what worries me more, looking at it from the US point of view. I would also note that in terms of industrial policy, even if China has been successful in the clean energy area, I think overall in the last decade or so, its industrial policy has actually hurt the Chinese economy and slowed growth, especially under Xi Jinping's regime. He's tried to divert a lot of economic activity out of areas that were successful into other areas. And the supply side of their economy seems to have suffered somewhat, and the growth rate seems to have slowed down. So I don't think the overall Chinese industrial policy model is something we'd want to emulate, even though I would admit that in areas like clean energy, maybe there is a good argument for certain specific policies done in China.
Yeah. So, right. Regarding what I was talking about in terms of the benefits of China's subsidies, I wasn't necessarily talking about their competitive position in various industries, whether China will make the cars, blah, blah, blah. I think maybe it's not clear how much industrial policy mattered for that. And in terms of Chinese growth, I think, if you read Barry Naughton, which everyone should, then you realize that China's rapid growth, its most rapid growth, came from liberalization, not from industrial policy. that was, China is the poster child for Milton Friedman. Deng Xiaoping is the great man of Chinese history, and his two handpicked successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, really just mostly continued the liberalization playbook. Hu Jintao started to mix it with industrial policies, but most of that explosive growth came from liberalization. And so I'm not saying industrial policy is what made China grow. In fact, I think it's possibly the opposite. I think liberalization is what made them grow primarily. And whether or not the shift toward industrial policy will help them or hurt them, the jury's still out on this. I think when I was talking about the success of China's industrial policy, I was talking about a very narrow success in terms of scaling up solar and batteries so that you take advantage of the learning effect and leverage the technological positive externality of research and development through scaling and learning effects to partially counteract the negative externality of carbon emissions. And so I think that was a narrow success in that field, but I'm not saying that China has grown fast because of industrial policy, because I think that so far that has not been the case. But I should say one other thing, which is, when you talk about whether industrial policy helps a developing country grow, I know lots of people like Nathan Lane and Rekha Juhash who are trying to figure that out. I think that there's never going to be a general answer to that, because so many different things get called industrial policy, first of all. And second of all, even if you have a consistent narrow definition of industrial policy, those things can be implemented well or poorly. There's a lot of devil in the details. So you can certainly point to industries where you say, okay, we're pretty sure industrial policy increased value added in that industry. But it's very hard to do the macro counterfactual where you come and say, okay, did that starve your other industries of resources in ways that were ultimately harmful to productivity? I don't know. You can't say. Macro is very hard to identify. And so I think that we know, for example, that the South Korea's heavy and chemical industrialization drive in the 70s was successful in terms of promoting those industries. That worked. What we don't know is whether that starved the Korean economy of resources in other industries that would have made Korea ultimately a richer country today had they not done that. And so those counterfactuals are very, very hard. And it's so not only are there 1,000,000,001 things that get called industrial policy. In fact, I would argue that in America, we are now calling deregulation industrial policy in many cases. And I've been calling it that. And I think that that's not inappropriate to say that, for example, land use deregulation. Like, I think that making NEPA and CEQA and these other environmental review laws that let you sue the government to stop any land use project, I think that making those a lot less powerful is a form of industrial policy that I want. And yet it's deregulation. It's not a binary thing between neoliberalism, free markets, and industrial policy. I think it cuts at an angle. It's not diametrically opposed, because sometimes deregulation can be industrial policies. And on top of that, even if you have a specific kind of industrial policy, like let's say subsidizing a particular industry, I think there's lots of implementation details where you can do it well or you can do it poorly, and that may make a big difference. And so I think that it's very difficult to come up with a verdict on industrial policy as a general thing, the way you'll see some fairly lazy articles in, like, say, The Economist or Financial Times do this. And so I think that having a debate about industrial policy, good or bad, is sort of doomed to failure, because I think that it encompasses so many things and it can be done well or poorly. You wouldn't say that, like, going to med school, good or bad. I can't tell you that. It depends on you. It depends on whether you really want to be a doctor. It depends on whether you're good at medicine. It depends on whether or not you go to a good med school, and blah, blah, blah. It depends on a lot of things. And it depends on what you do after med school, whether you start your own practice or go to, it depends on so many things. I can't tell you whether going to med school is good, and I can't tell you whether industrial policy is categorically good or bad.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Every time I hop on the 101 freeway in SF, I look up at the various tech billboards and think, damn, turpentine should definitely be up there. And I bet I'm not alone. In a world of endless scrolling and ad blockers, sometimes the most powerful way to reach people is in the real world. That's where AdQuick comes in. The easiest way to book out-of-home ads, like billboards, vehicle wraps, and airport displays. The same way you would order an Uber. Started by Instacart alums, AdQuick was born from their own personal struggles to book and measure ad success. AdQuick's audience targeting, campaign management, and analytics bring the precision and efficiency of digital to the real world. Ready to get your brand the attention it deserves? Visit adquick.com today to start reaching your customers in the real world. Again, that's AdQuick.com.
Great. Actually, some of those points were on my list, so I'm glad you made them. I had planned to talk about things like deregulation of housing construction, especially in the area of, like what can we do to help, say, working class people have stronger growth in real wages? What kind of industrial policies would do that? I see all sorts of deregulation as probably the most effective way, especially housing costs, since that's a big one in holding back living standards, but also healthcare costs, which some types of deregulation, making it easier to go to medical school, things like that, more competition in healthcare can help bring down costs. There's a wide range of areas where those kind of changes can be successful. So, but it seems like I think we end up probably agreeing more than I expected. But when I read the media, much of the discussion of industrial policy almost automatically gets linked in with sort of an anti-market perspective. Like there's the free market people and there's the industrial policy people. I think what I'm hearing from you is that's a false dichotomy and that you can to some extent embrace both. But I think that hasn't really been the history of the debate. The debate has focused a lot on kind of whether neoliberalism is a good thing or a bad thing, and whether we need to move beyond neoliberalism towards industrial policy. And what I'm hearing from you is we can have a lot of neoliberalism and have some targeted industrial policies to address specific topics, which is, I think, a much more reasonable point to advocate than sort of blanket rejection of neoliberalism that I get in some of the advocates of industrial policy. So that's good to hear. And again, maybe I could mention a few other topics. I mean, probably the area where we'll disagree the most is national defense. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we want to get into that because there's a lot of this where I do agree with you. I think that my framework on national defense, as I said, I'm very strongly opposed to the current worldwide trend towards authoritarian nationalism. So that's the starting point. Second, I'm skeptical of I favor trying to avoid war wherever possible. So my current view is that the biggest threat to the world by far today is Russia because it's an expansionist power. And therefore, I favor industrial policies to restrain Russia. Okay. China is a trickier issue. China is also a problem in some respects. However, I don't put it in the same grouping with Russia for various reasons. One point I like to make is China's policies often annoy the West. Russia's policy is to annoy the West. Russia's basically a troll nation under Vladimir Putin. So I view Russia as by far the biggest potential threat to world peace. However, I think concern over China is, certainly valid. There's a lot of things about Chinese policy that do trouble me. You've mentioned South China Sea, a potential attack on Taiwan, and so on. So then the question becomes, what's the best solution when you have a tricky situation like this? And the way my framework is to think in terms of the expected cost of war is what we really want to minimize because war can be so destructive. And the expected cost of war is the probability of war times the expected damage if there is a war. Okay. So for instance, in the 1930s, the US put sanctions on Japan, probably believing that that improves the situation. That is, they certainly increased the probability of war with Japan, but the view was that the reduction in the expected damage from war was greater than the increase in the probability of war with Japan. In fact, it was probably exactly the opposite. I think that sort of economic warfare where the country dramatically increases the risk of military war in the future. It makes countries feel like they don't have much to lose because they've been cut off economically anyway. So my fear is that the current road we're going down with China, I understand the arguments in favor of some of these sanctions, but I feel like they're increasing the probability of war to an extent that more than is greater than the reduction in the expected damage if there is a war. And so that's where I disagree with the foreign policy establishment in Washington. I think they underestimate that And I would just make one final point. There's two parts to this. Our economic warfare with China, if you want to call it that, is motivated by some valid military concerns, but also a lot of other political stuff that's just completely unrelated to foreign policy. For instance, the trade, tariffs in the first Trump administration basically had nothing to do with foreign policy. It was just Trump and his people believed they will reduce the trade deficit, they will bring back manufacturing to the United States. That economic policy needlessly antagonized China without even producing any foreign policy benefits. Now, in other areas like cutting off, high level chips and so on, you can argue there's a foreign policy thing there, not selling materials that are important for military uses. But we weren't even doing that. We weren't even doing the minimum of trying to maintain good relations with China in ordinary business, but cutting off militarily sensitive items. We were just going out of our way to antagonize China with industrial policies that weren't even doing any good for the US economy. So that I'm not, accusing you of supporting those things, but that made me more cynical about our overall approach to China, which I think is dangerously veering towards a view where war is inevitable. And I think that's a very dangerous road to go down because we don't know what would happen with a war with China. Once a war starts, you just don't know how it's going to play out. So in my view, we should be doing everything possible to avoid war with China. That doesn't mean axing to Chinese bullying. So we should continue to insist on free navigation through the South China Sea and all that stuff. Not let ourselves be bullied by China, but not go out of our way to antagonize China also. So that's probably where I disagree most with the whole, foreign policy establishment in Washington right now.
Well, yeah, so I think we pretty substantively disagree on this. And I think you grew up your entire life and lived most of your life in a world created from a specific backdrop with certain ground truths and background facts shaping and creating the world and the ideas and the policy dilemmas, etc. All the things that you've known your entire life were created with the backdrop of America and its allies having overwhelming preponderance in manufacturing industries, which is what won us World War II and is what established conventional deterrence in the Cold War, such that the Soviet Union was really unable to launch a conventional attack. And so nuclear deterrence had to, mutually assured destruction ended up preventing a major war because we had conventional escalation dominance because we could manufacture much more than them. That backdrop that you have lived your entire life under is now gone. China now manufactures as much as America, Europe, Japan, and South Korea combined, and it's only going up. And so China is now able to do to us, if it chooses, what we could have done to, what we did do to Germany and Japan, could have done to the USSR in terms of out manufacturing them. That creates an unstable situation. And your suppositions about what China wants and what it doesn't, what will deter it and what won't, what will make it more hostile and what won't, etc., are fine. I don't think you shouldn't be making such suppositions. I make them too, and we come to different conclusions. But neither of us as a foreign policy expert. Studying monetary economics has not made you an expert on, on international relations, and writing about economics has not made me an expert on international relations. So we can disagree about the particulars of what China will do, and I do think you're wrong about that. But at the same time, what I do know is that if you think about the game theory of the situation, you think that once we lose escalation dominance, once China is able to simply out-manufacture us in terms of conventional arms by dual using all of its manufacturing industries to just outproduce both us and all of our allies combined at the same time, we fundamentally then live in a different world than the one you grew up in, and even than the one I grew up in. We live in a new world where democracies do not have a preponderance of manufacturing ability. Whether or not we are more efficient and productive and have higher standards of living and nicer whatever than people in China is irrelevant to this point, which is that you live in a world where the most powerful country in the world is an authoritarian dictatorship. And all the stuff that you're thinking about, what can we do to influence their, opinion of us by doing this or that, I think is a bit secondary to the fact that they have the ability to simply out-manufacture and destroy all of the democracies at once. And then, of course, we'd have to deter them with nukes, assuming that our nukes work and haven't been hacked, but that's another conversation. We'd have to deter them with nukes like the Soviet Union did to us, in the Cold War. And that's not necessarily a good position to be in. And so I think that, you're trying to apply we're both trying to apply our own amateurish assessments of China as a country and of its foreign policy and its society and the opinions of its leaders and its people. We're trying to apply our amateurish models to determining whether or not, we'll make them angry or we'll deter them or blah, blah, blah. And I do think you're wrong about those things. I think that deterrence has to be a much more important component of our approach than you probably think. But I think that there's this ground truth that we must be able to manufacture as much as them, or preferably more than them, not just the United States as a country, because we're much smaller than them, but us and all our allies combined, whatever group of allies we have combined. If we don't, we are, in a very real sense, at the mercy of that authoritarian regime. And your opinions and my opinions then matter little, as does our economic freedom. We live in a world where whether we have economic freedom will be determined in Beijing by a guy that you never talk to. And you can write all the blog posts you want, and I can write all the blog posts I want, and Beijing is going to care precisely zero.
Sure. Well, just to be clear, I do favor maintaining a strong deterrence. I think that's very important. I was really talking about a different issue than deterrence, which is economic warfare against China. I think of that as a separate subject from deterrence. In terms of manufacturing, so I would say that I don't accept your premise that the size of the manufacturing sector determines the military strength of a country. So, China can manufacture all the iPhones it wants, all the washing machines it wants, etc. That by itself doesn't give it ability to project military force to the United States. That's a very, very different concept. So again, I'm not an expert on military strategy and so on, but I just don't accept that framing. But let's just agree to disagree on that. And let's accept your premise that an important foreign policy goal for the United States should be to boost our manufacturing sector. Okay.
I will not agree to disagree, because I think that understanding the particulars of the technology in this case is incredibly salient to the question of optimal policy. I will not agree to disagree, because whether China can make washing machines, I don't know that washing machines are the important part, but whether China can make batteries and drones, for example, whether China makes all the batteries and drones, if you look at the battlefields of Ukraine, you see that drones are taking over the battlefield. That doesn't mean that drones are a one-shot push-button weapon that will destroy everything and is the only thing that matters, but it means that drones are rapidly becoming the most important weapon of modern warfare. A drone is a battery, a motor, some sensors, and some microcontrollers, and some plastic injection molding. Currently, almost every single one of those is made overwhelmingly by China, of the most important weapon of modern war. That's as important as the gun was in World War II, or let's say the artillery shell. And China makes all of that. Almost all of those, that is made by China. So no, we can't simply wave our hands and say, oh, washing machines aren't going to help them invade us. Drones are. Batteries are. That's what they make. That's what they make all of. So we cannot simply label technology as A, like you would in a macroeconomic model, and say that understanding technology is irrelevant to understanding the economics of the situation, because we know what the important weapons of modern warfare are, and we know that China is making almost all of those.
Okay. Well, but that's a different argument from your previous argument. Was what mattered was the total size of manufacturing, I thought. Now you're saying it's specific types of manufactured goods that matter, right?
I could continue the list. I could talk about auto manufacturing and how that can be repurposed for ships and planes and tanks. I could talk about machinery manufacturing, machine tools, and how those are useful. I could talk about ship manufacturing. I could talk about chip manufacturing, electronics, semiconductor manufacturing, every single one of these manufacturing things. There are a very few areas where manufacturing is only useful for civilian purposes. And those are the ones in which we dominate and China doesn't, right? So manufacturing of medical devices to test if you have diabetes, that's where we dominate. The things that can't be used for the dual use thing. So yes, yes, we need to think about specific technologies and specific manufacturing products. But once we start thinking in those terms, the situation becomes even more lopsided. Once we start thinking about only the 80% of manufacturing industries that can be dual used for war, China has an even bigger lead than if you look at simple value added. And the only reason I look at simple value added is because there's nice little charts on that I can post and get everyone to look at. But if you start looking at specific technologies, the situation is even worse, and the need for industrial policy is even greater.
Scott, do you agree with that point around the specific sort of dual use technologies that we should make sure to have at least parity, if not a lead, in manufacturing them?
I think we should have sufficiency. It's very hard to know exactly how much we need, because you need a scenario of what kind of war would we be fighting with China. That's a very hard thing to define, right? Like, on the surface, we're both nuclear powers, right? So you'd have to figure it would probably end up being a nuclear war.
But the game theory of conventional deterrence is pretty simple. If we have to escalate to nuclear exchanges, China can do a lot of things short of outright conquest of the entire world, and we can't do anything to stop them, because the only thing we could do to stop them would be mutually assured destruction. And we saw this with the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The United States had the commanding lead in the Cold War because we had conventional escalation dominance, which meant that the only way yes, if we had invaded the Soviet Union, they could have nuked us. But the Soviet Union was not going to nuke the entire world to get its way on any, one smaller policy question that was not existential. And in the same way, China will be able to do whatever it wants to us, short of something existential where we'd have to nuke them, where we might as well all die. The game theory is not ambiguous here. Conventional deterrence matters. In fact, it was actually, ironically, John Mearsheimer who kind of pointed this out, but the people at RAND pointed this out a lot. Whereas when the only button you can press, the only contingency you have is to destroy the entire world, you are effectively powerless in almost every single situation. And then we are at the mercy of authoritarians who don't care about your blog and don't care about my blog.
Okay, so let's take this in pieces, because there's a lot going on here. So we have to think about a scenario. What kind of scenario are we probably looking at where this issue would come into play? We know we have a war now between Russia and Ukraine, right? We know what the US policy is in that war. By the way, I support that policy. The scenario I see discussed most often as a potential trigger for a US China war is a China invasion of Taiwan. So then we have to think about, well, what kind of response would make sense for the United States in that scenario? What are we wargaming for? And it isn't clear to me what the US foreign policy is. Like, I know what our policy is with Ukraine. It's to assist Ukraine in, repelling the Russian invasion, but not committing US military to fight with Russia. And based on what I read, the reason that's often cited as to why we're not fighting in Ukraine, because we fear an escalation to nuclear war with Russia. If Russia didn't have any nukes, NATO would perhaps be helping Ukraine out. I don't know. That's what I read. Now, you're free to disagree with that assumption, but this is sort of the working assumption I have when I look at the Russia-Ukraine situation. So then we look at China and Taiwan, and I ask, how is that different? Everybody says it's completely different, but it's not clear to me what our strategy is in Taiwan. So I don't really know what sort of weapon systems the US needs unless I know what kind of scenario we're looking at. What are we envisioning here? Are we envisioning a Chinese invasion of the US mainland? I think obviously not. If we're envisioning China doing something we don't like in East Asia, what is our policy? We've seen Russia do something we don't like in Ukraine. We know what our policy is there. What would our response be in East Asia? I don't know. So it's very hard for me to know what kind of weapon systems the US needs. I certainly favor the US having a strong deterrence. I favor us having adequate weapon systems. Maybe we have to subsidize industries that produce things like drones so that we don't rely on Chinese drones. I don't know what the US current military plans are in that area. I know there's a lot of kind of new companies. I think Anduril is one that are producing more high-tech weapons that would be useful in future wars, where existing technology like battleships and so on may be sitting ducks for advanced missiles. I'm not an expert on all of that. I presume the US military should be thinking about what weapon systems it needs. and focusing on those. But I think that whole area of what do we need for national defense, to me, that's a long way from the way the word industrial policy is usually used. To me, that's like military policy. And if you kind of jumped on me a little bit when I said I wanted to talk about like boosting manufacturing as a whole, that's like we can have a conversation about like bringing manufacturing back to America as a general concept, and we can have a conversation about specific industries that we want to promote or about both. But I think we have to be specific. So I have certain views on how to help manufacturing as a whole. I've already mentioned them briefly, things like reducing our budget deficit, changing our tax code. There's all sorts of things we can do to boost manufacturing in the United States that I would strongly favor. That's point one. Point two, I see a lot of industrial policy proponents proposing things that in fact do not work, like tariffs. Tariffs do not bring back manufacturing. We've seen that under 2 administrations. And economic theory predicts that tariffs will fail because they don't address the root cause of savings, investment, and balances. So for manufacturing as a whole, I have pretty strongly held views because I do have some expertise in that area as an economist to offer my opinion on that subject. If you get into drones, yes, I'm not an expert on warfare. I don't know exactly what the US military should be doing in the area of drone manufacturing, and maybe we should be doing more in that area. I guess if you want to call that an industrial policy, then I might favor that policy. But I see the term industrial policy being used in a way to sort of reshape the economy away from a market economy in many areas that to me have nothing to do with the specific objectives that are outlined or used to justify the specific policies. So, I think we'd have to get down to specifics before I could really better understand exactly where you're coming from on this.
I agree. And I think that the specifics are the important thing here. And so I think I do have a hard stop. And I think that that's probably the conclusion that I would agree with most strongly, is that the specifics matter. And I think that my 2 messages on industrial policy are, number one, we need it in some form because of some things, but most overwhelmingly because of the China situation. We need industrial policy in some form, and the specifics of that are not immediately obvious. It's not clear what, exactly which industrial policies we need and what the targets are supposed to be. And I agree that Trump's tariffs were not especially effective policy in terms of, in terms of reindustrializing America. Certainly, they didn't even move the needle on manufacturing. When you look at Biden's policies, the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually a green technology battery building act, have absolutely moved the needle. America actually now manufactures 80% of its own solar panels, which will be useful if we're getting most of our energy from solar and we get cut off from China in a war. Battery factories are going up everywhere in America. Chip factories are going up everywhere in America. And the proportion of chips that America makes is forecast to rise for the first time in decades, thanks to the CHIPS Act. And so when I look at industrial policies, I do not think about 2018 tariffs. I think about 2022, Biden policies. And I think that we've seen successes in areas of technology that I can draw a very explicit, very clear and simple to understand line directly from chips to military stuff and China. And as for whether or not China wants to attack Taiwan and all that stuff, we can argue about that all day, and I don't actually know. But as soon as you start to base your thoughts about economic policy on Kremlinology, of reading the tea leaves of what China really wants to do and really doesn't want to do, you're in the bargaining stage of grief at that point. And like I said, I do have to go, but I think my final message is we need to do something. It's not immediately obvious what the exact things we need to do are. It's clearly possible for some of the policies that people talk about being in this direction, like Trump's tariffs in his first term, being counterproductive or just useless, a waste of money, etc. But when we look at some of the specific policies that Biden did, I think we see tentative early signs of important successes in areas that I can absolutely assure you are important for the military balance. And so that's not the kind of thing that can be, dismissed with a hand wave and the idea that like free markets are good and industrial policy always fails, and these old nostrums that were easy to tell ourselves when we had all the world's manufacturing capacity back in the 90s.
Noah, Scott, thank you for the great conversation. I'm mindful of time. Noah, I know you got to go. As always, until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Until next time.
Econ 102 is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Moment of Zen, In the Arena, The Cognitive Revolution, and more. If you like what you hear, subscribe and leave us a review in the App Store. You can keep up with both of our Substacks for written analysis of the topics we cover in the show at noahopinion.substack.com and eriktorenberg.substack.com. Thanks for listening.